Welcome back, Chappelle. Or wait, welcome back, Honors, actually. So, we have a short-ish flip this weekend, talking mostly about Athens, right? Because in class we left off talking about Sparta. Before y'all broke into your groups and y'all started picking your myths that y'all are going to become experts in for your first project, which is going to be awesome, right? I'm very, very excited. I'm very excited a lot about some of the different myths y'all picked. I've heard some Narcissus and some Echo and some, of course, the Pandora myth, which has a lot of modern day impacts. But very proud, very excited. But let's get into it, all right? So we started talking about Spartan society and like the inspection of newborn children. Their government being two kings and a council of elders, right? Which, ironically enough, the Spartans did use democracy to elect that council of elders, right? Each district of the Spartan kingdom would actually elect their council of elders who would advise those two kings that actually served for life, right? So, technically, the Spartans were the first ones to invent democracy, right? So, before Athens did, which is their big claim to fame, right? Now, big thing about their lives, though, that you got to talk about, of course, is like the helots, right? The slaves that they used to actually do all of their farming for them were actually conquered people, which was a big contention of crisis. They were constantly under the threat of like slave revolt. And then also, of course, that every Spartan male was expected to go off and become a Spartan soldier, right? So speaking of that, they left home at 7, right? They were inspected when they were born. They were moved into a barracks, of course, when they were, excuse me, the second they left for military training. They got one big meal a day. Blood soup. What do you think about that, Maria? Blood soup.
Iron rich.
Iron rich? It's pretty gross, if you ask me. It's blood mixed with vinegar and cocoa bones. What? All right, now, anyway, so to develop sneakiness, of course, the boys were encouraged to steal food. However, if they were caught, it was very, very severely punished. All right, so very, very sneaky, kind of exactly like the two dogs that we have running around here all the time, who somehow get past us and get into the bathroom and then eat all the toilet paper and all the other stuff, which I guess they're cunning. All right, now, at age 20, men could go off in Sparta and get married. However, they had to stay in the barracks for another 10 years. They weren't allowed to move out and live with their wife and family until they were at least 30 years old and had some military experience. So, which is a very intense form of society. But speaking of Spartan women, right, first and foremost, marriages were arranged, right? But women in Sparta did have more rights than women in, per se, Athens, right? So, like, for example, right here, this Spartan women exercise sculpture, this sculpture was made around circa like 500 BC, and it shows a woman from Sparta actually doing like a lunge and trying to exercise, right? Because women in Sparta would actually meet up in the city squares every single day, required, and they had to exercise with one another to keep their bodies in shape because they believed Spartan women created Spartan soldiers, right? So they were required to exercise and strengthen their bodies, but they could inherit property. They had to listen to their husbands, so their rights were still not what we would have wanted them to be in our modern era, and definitely not what we're looking for. And it's still very disgusting when we talk about women's rights in ancient Greece, but they did have more rights in Sparta than they did in Athens. Women in Sparta could even initiate divorce if they were being mistreated. So women in Sparta did have, by way of a lot of other groups, quite a few more rights than actually women did in other areas. So, but Sparta, though, on the other flip side of it, is going to start to begin to do another really big thing. They're going to start to isolate themselves away from the other Greeks, right? Citizens were not allowed to travel, and they were discouraged to trade. This made them very, very unique and very, very deadly. A lot of the earliest instances when Spartans would actually communicate with other Greeks was only when they were hired as a military force, almost like a mercenary force, right? So, but now we got to get into the Athenians, right? The Athenians, of course, their big claim to fame is they believe that they were ruled by the people, right? Now, this right here is a modern-day picture of Athens, of course, because it's the current-day capital of Greece, right? That right there is the Acropolis of Athens. That actually still contains the Parthenon that you can go see today, which is it's a big one on my list. I definitely got to get over there sometime. You hear that, Maria? Oh, by the way, I forgot to mention, Katie and Allie, great job today at the race. We were really, really excited to come see you guys run. So, speaking of, though, now, Claim to fame. Big thing about the Athenians is they claim to not be settled by the Dorians, right? So remember when we talked about the Dorians? The Dorians were the barbaric group that invaded going into the Greek Dark Ages, right? So the Spartans were like, I mean, yeah, we were probably settled by the Dorians because they came in and kind of took over the entire area, so of course we're probably settled by the Dorians. Athenians refuse to admit that they're settled by the Dorians, so they always claim that they were settled by the Ionians, right? And the Ionians were a separate group of people that are believed to have existed towards Turkey, and actually towards like the breaking point between Turkey and southern Russia, right? So much more of an ocean-faring people. So the Athenians refuse out the gate, as you can see, to even admit the fact that they are going to be settled by people that might have been responsible for the destruction of Western civilization up until that point, right? So they started out, though, like many other Greek states, as an aristocracy, right? Now, what an aristocracy, there are three big government styles you're going to need to remember, and you can jot these down in your notes over to the side somewhere if you would like. But you're going to need to remember when we're talking about ancient Greece. Aristocracy, an oligarchy, democracy, right? So aristocracy is when wealthy landowners were actually in charge, right? When basically you're talking about noble families, right? Families that have had so much wealth for so long and have owned so much land, they are considered a different social class, right? For example, my family, right, in North Carolina, the Terrys have owned the same 500-acre plot of land in Durham, North Carolina, since 1806, right? So you're talking about been there for several hundred years, right? Now, granted, let's pretend for a second that they're also really wealthy, right? And they're not, but like let's pretend for a second that they're really wealthy. We would be considered like the aristocracy of Durham County, North Carolina, right? Because we've been there for so long, then we had so much land and we had so much wealth that we actually were a different social class above commoners, right? So that's an aristocracy. And of course, like many other ancient civilizations, aristocracies were the first ones to actually challenge and go for ruling authority because they could read, they could write, they had access to education, right? So they had all these other like abilities upon themselves. Now the second one is an oligarchy, right? The oligarchy is a small number of wealthy citizens that had been elected by the aristocracy, right? So it's taking this big aristocracy and whittling it down into a few of them. Let's say 3, 4, 5, right? That's an oligarchy, right? Those 3, 4, 5 men were actually in charge of the Athenian state, right? So wealth in Athens is going to grow extremely fast, especially amongst the upper class, which everybody thought was a little surprising, right? But they begin to grow and grow and grow, and they started to pull in a lot of other small Greek settlements to form one gigantic city-state known as Athens, right? Much larger than Sparta, possibly a larger population. I'd probably have to go look that up. I've never even bothered to even question that before. Now I'm dying, and now I actually need to know like so badly, and it's killing me. But they grew very, very large, very, very fast. But think about this for like 2 seconds. If you're pulling in a lot of smaller Greek settlements, that means you're pulling in a lot of poorer people. You're pulling in a lot of uneducated people. You're pulling in a lot of farmers and just kind of your regular everyday local, right? So you're not pulling in other aristocrats, right? So problems because of this are going to begin to arise. Now, this is like a little title inside of the Athens section. It's mainly all about government reform, all right? So problems are going to begin to arise, which is going to change the landscape of Western civilization forever, right? So due to these issues that Athens had to deal with, they actually are going to be the bedrock foundation for the first truly Western democracy that anybody had ever seen. And it kind of like, it set the tone for everyone else for a long time until the Romans fell, and then their republic went with them. And then for about 1,000 years, we were in the Middle Ages, which is just people running around farming dirt, right? So, but it happens, right? Now, Athens, though, unfortunately, in this whole situation, had grown much too large, much too fast, right? So with this, the main thing was that the main issue they were having is they were struggling to feed the city, right? They were struggling to feed their city-state. Mainly because, remember, when we go back when we were looking at the geography of Greece, Greece's farmland is terrible, right? Absolutely awful. Only 20% of the entire country can even sustain some type of agriculture, right? So they're running out of the ability to feed themselves, okay? And the poor are also growing extremely furious because of two particular reasons. One was called debt slavery, and the other one's called the horos, right? So let's talk about debt slavery first, right? So debt slavery was the method of enslavement used in ancient Athens, right? Let's say hypothetically you've got little Josie, right? Josie, come here, Josie. Come here. So Josie right here, come here. So Josie right here is a poor, common Athenian, right? She's got no money, and she has a, what kind of farm do you have? Olives? You want to have an olive farm? How about that? All right, so she's got an olive farm, right? But the problem that she has is that she's really, really struggling to make ends meet. And she needs a loan from me, an aristocrat, right, a noble of Athens, to try and keep her farm going. If y'all can see how much she is loving this scratch. All right, so she needs, right, a loan to actually keep it going. The problem is, though, according to debt slavery, she has to put up her family as collateral, all right? So if you don't know what collateral is, let me explain it to you real quick. It's kind of the idea that should your loan go belly up, it's what the person who gave you the loan gets for free, right? So that means that she has to put up her brother Rufio, right, who's over in the other room. He's asleep right now, though. He's very sleepy. All right, so, but yeah, she has to put up her entire family as collateral. So when she can't pay me back, that means I get to own her, right? So that's how slavery existed in ancient Athens. You're very sweet today. Now, anyway, so also, though, let's say hypothetically we have another individual, right? So let's say, like, before this even breaks down, Josie would have to erect this thing on her property called a horos, right? Which is a big stone slab basically saying that I own her and her family, right? So this big stone slab said all the things she owed me, and it was a very, very disgusting thing to have on your land, and it just further separated all of the Athenians from the aristocracy, creating even more of a social barrier, right? So you've got debt slavery and the horos, right? So the horos is a very big problem, leading a lot of Athenians to want to rebel because they felt that they were just being so disenfranchised, right? And then on top of all this, aristocrats were fighting each other for power, right? So as people tend to do, once you have any wealthy group of men typically trying to actually be they don't share power very well, and they start fighting each other for it, right? So the big reason why they were fighting for power is because they all wanted to become what was known as a tyrant, right? So a tyrant was a position in Athens, an actual legitimate position. I know we use the word tyrant now to describe a ruling authority, right? We'll be like, oh, Mr. Terry's a tyrant. Terry the tyrant. Mr. Terry is a tyrant because he's so mean and he like messes with Jaden all the time and blah, 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 like, which is not true. But the tyrant position was when an Athenian, typically an aristocratic Athenian, was brought in with complete control during a time of crisis or a time of war, right? But the problem is they were supposed to leave when the crisis was over. A lot of these men aren't going to do that, and they're going to try and keep their power. Or they're going to try and make sweeping reforms to benefit them and the other aristocrats, and then also keep the poor, right? So this whole tyrant system was kind of just failing, right? But then this guy came along amidst a huge rebellion, a big famine, and a big issue, right? This guy's name is Solon. Yeah, Solon. So Solon is going to change the government forever. This guy in 594 BC was elected to this position known as an Archon, right? So now a lot of historians debate this. Because he is an aristocrat himself. Let's not even think we're being weird about this. Like, he was a wealthy landowner himself. But a lot of historians think, some of them think that he was elected as a tyrant. Some of them think that he was elected as an Archon. Some of them, but all we really need to be concerned about is that he was in charge of the government in about 594 BC during all of this chaos, right? And he's going to come in and make sweeping reforms, right? He's like, this is ridiculous. We can't feed ourselves. We're not making any money right now. We're losing all this. You got poor Josies over there that are in debt slavery that are just getting absolutely wasted by the economy. So he comes in and he makes all these big reforms. One of the biggest ones, speaking of Josie, who has an olive farm, right? He says, no longer are any of our farms making anything other than one item. You are exporting olive oil, and that is it, right? And people like Josie were like, but I like olives to eat. And he was like, I don't care what you like, right? Olive oil is our big export because it was worth so much money, right? Because he knew that he could then take that money and give it back to people like Josie to prevent her from being disenfranchised. So he's actually looking out for them, right? He outlaws debt slavery as well. And also, Oh, wait, speaking of the debt slavery, he makes it completely illegal for a person to own another person that is a citizen of Athens, because ironically enough, they still had slaves from conquered territories. We're not going to get into that right now. But it made it illegal for an Athenian to own another Athenian, right? And then also those horos, those big stone slabs that Josie had to live with on with her farm, he has them all demolished, right? So, and he starts pushing Athens towards a democracy. And the big thing that he does is he makes leadership on the oligarchy, like the little small group of people elected, the oligarchy, he makes it based on wealth, not on lineage, right? Which a lot of y'all are like, well, wait a minute. The aristocrats are all the rich people. So how's this different, right? So, well, lineage means that, like, if I had a son, my son then gets to be a part of the ruling class by default, right? By making it about wealth, it expands that group of people to a much larger state, right? So, but these are huge reforms. And Athens is going to go through several different really, really good leaders and really, really bad leaders, right? So it's going to go through some really, really good times and some really, really rough times. It's going to have a borderline civil war and a famine and then like blah, 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 blah. But Solon's reforms were finally realized. When he left, he actually told him, he was like, look, stick to my system for 10 years, all right? Just stick to it for 10 years. Try your best not to like go away from it. They lasted for about 5, right? So like they lasted for about 5 years. They bought in this other guy named Cleisthenes. And then one of Solon's cousins ruled for a little while, and then Cleisthenes was really good, but then Isagoporus was bad. It's like a whole thing, right? Like so. And if I was teaching a course on ancient Greece, I would talk about those guys. But Solon's the one you need to worry about, right? So, but after all this time, and after all the big reforms that Solon made, Athenian democracy was finally realized towards about 510 BC, right? So about like 60 years, or well. Yeah, even a little bit further. I'll double check on that date. Don't write that date down. But in the circle, like early 500s BC, right? So everyone after these reforms was then allowed to vote, right? So because as long as you weren't a woman. So sorry. All right. So now, but everyone, if you were an Athenian, regardless of your property, regardless of how much money you had, was then allowed to vote, right? So ostracism was also adopted, which was this new system where Athenians could vote to decide to kick someone out of the city-state for a certain amount of time, usually anywhere from a year to 10 years, depending on how much they hated the person, right? And then that person was allowed to come back after that certain amount of time, but it gave the city enough time to kind of rebound after someone's poor decision-making. That word ostracism, just kind of underline it or whatever. It would be like, hypothetically speaking, you're like, all right, Mr. Terry, you've been doing too much. We're going to ostracize you for a week, right? So, and I would have to leave for a week, and then I would finally come back, which would have made me, it's like time out. It's like time out for a political leader, right? That's a huge way to look at it. Now, Athens also was going to be divided into a series of tribes, much like the nome system in ancient Egypt, right? A genius idea that creates things like regional states, right? This new government, though, unfortunately made people like Sparta furious. You know what I mean? Because it's going against the way things were done, right? It's going against the idea that only the influential and the educated should be allowed to make decisions, right? The way Sparta looked at it, it was like, you're allowing this mob to lead your entire government, you're dumb. But then in the background, Sparta's got slaves that are ready to kill them in any minute. You know what I mean? So, like, it's a very, very rough situation. But just know that Sparta is getting very furious. But now we got to talk about 2 more things, right? Athenian women and Athenian education, right? So, Athenian women had it very, very rough, as you can already tell, right? So, they could not participate in politics. They ran the entire household. They were not allowed in the agora whatsoever. They were not even allowed to leave the home in Athens without a male escort of some type, right? So, or without direct male permission to go to the agora to pick up something. Yet, ironically enough, women were essential for every religious ceremony Athens had. So they would just basically keep them in like cupboards in their homes and then bring them out when they needed them, right? So women actually had much more freedom in Sparta. So forever how great the democracy in Athens was, the women still were extremely disenfranchised. Right here, actually, as you can say, no, go back. All right, so really, you're going to be like this. Come on, Prezi. There we go. This right here actually shows the one place that women were allowed to go to without a male escort. The communal well. That's really about it. They were allowed to go and conversate with other women at the well, but that's the only place they were allowed to venture on their own, right? But Athens, though, also is going to adopt an amazing education system, right? As seen right here on this, like, one of the red figure pots that was actually used, or I think that's a red figure plate. It actually describes the education system in Athens very, very well, right? Now, unfortunately, as you can see, it's only reserved for young male citizens. But as you can see by looking at all the imagery, their education system was very, very multifaceted, right? Had a lot of different subjects and stuff like that. Boys attended school if the family could afford it, right? So most of your aristocrat families are actually going to be educated. But they learned to read, write, study music, memorize poetry, even public speaking so they could eventually participate in the political sphere, right? And they received some but very little military training, right? And that's going to be it. That's your flip for today. G, you're going to be doing this Monday night, and E, you did this tonight. So I guess I'll see you guys on Monday, E, and then I'll see you guys on, well, I'll see all y'all on Monday. So I'll see you guys then. Have a good one.